Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn. Like many of you, at the end of last year, I learned for the first time about something called the Metaverse. The Metaverse, I have now learned, can be described as a network of 3D virtual worlds focused on social interaction and using artificial intelligence. The Metaverse engages the senses of users to create virtual worlds. In today's episode, we'll be expanding on this notion of what the Metaverse is and what it can be used for, who controls or contributes to it, as well as the legal and regulatory issues. To guide us through this discussion, we're joined by legal and policy experts. Vas Bednar is the executive director of the McMaster Program for Public Policy and an adjunct professor and an expert in AI, tech, and big data. Imran Ahmed is a lawyer and head of technology and co-head of privacy and cybersecurity at Norton Rose Fulbright. Thank you both so much for joining me today. I'm so excited for this conversation because it's a really new area for me, and it's a great opportunity not just for our viewers to learn, but for me to learn as well. And I want to start by asking you, Vas, about the definition I gave of the metaverse there at the beginning. Is there something you'd like to expand on there?
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned the word platform. I would offer, it's a persistent virtual space where you can spend your time and you can interact with other people, but also interact with advertisers and brands, if that's helpful at all.
I think that's helpful because it's always there, Imran, same question to you. How would you explain the metaverse to someone who's never heard of it before?
I think the easiest analogy I can give is for those of your audience members who watch Star Trek, they'll know what a holodeck looks like. It's a different world which is created where there's interaction going on. So you're not just watching something, you're actually immersed in it and interacting with different parts of it as well. And it's very dynamic. So I think that's the way I typically explain it. And we're seeing a lot of that happening right now. I'm sure we're going to get into that a bit later.
Yeah, so Vas, can you give an example of something that you could do in the metaverse? What would that experience look like?
Something you can do. Well, one of the best ways for us to understand that, other than looking at the current gaming world, the kind of current norms in augmented or alternative reality, is just to look at Meta's or Facebook's patents. So there's a lot of patents on, pinching and grabbing objects and interacting. So I want to put that emphasis on kind of not just watching something. It's not just a visual experience that's kind of 2D, but again, it's the experience aspect. And you might also be able to have your body mapped so that, ostensibly so that you can try on clothes or have your clothing draped properly. But that leads us to one of the risks where you're giving up a lot of information about your body just to participate and go to this 3D space.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to get into some of those risks in the later segments. But first, let's talk about what you said specifically is interesting. I usually think of the metaverse as those kind of VR goggles, but what you're saying is you could actually have sort of pinpoints on your body that get detected as well. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that would be part of preparing you to have your avatar in the metaverse so that it can be more precise and more accurate in terms of the likeness.
And the avatar, for our viewers who might not know, is sort of your virtual representation of yourself. It can look like you, but it can also look like someone else or something else entirely. Imran, can you describe how, if someone wants to try one of these virtual worlds, metaverse worlds, where would they start? What would be the easiest way to sort of start off if this is new to you?
So the interesting part about the metaverse is it's still at its embryonic stages. We haven't really expanded to the point where we get the full value of what the metaverse may look like. And I'm sure we're going to talk about it, including in surgical procedures and military training. We're seeing potentials there. But for somebody who wants to just get a taste of what the metaverse looks like, it's actually the example you gave earlier. A couple of years ago, Facebook acquired Oculus for virtual gaming. And so you can put these goggles on, you have your digital avatar that you can select with certain features and profiles, and then you can be in this world, whatever that world is in that game, move around, interact, accomplish certain tasks, and so on. Relatively modest in terms of initial investment if somebody just wants to get a feel of what the metaverse may look like. One of the interesting pieces I'll just mention is it's all about the senses and the immersive experience. So the goggles only get you so far, right? I mean, if you can't smell, if you can't feel, it's going to be a very different experience than somebody who is fully immersed in it, who has those sensors that you were talking about a bit earlier.
Now, we've only got 10 seconds. Is there a cost to joining one of these?
In terms of joining for a game, not so much, but in terms of getting the hardware for now, yes.
All right, when we get back from this commercial break, we're going to discuss some of the legal implications in the metaverse. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the metaverse and the legal and policy implications of this new virtual world or worlds. Now, Imran, I want to ask you about who are the major players involved in this new frontier. What companies are involved? What are the names of these different worlds? And can these worlds sort of overlap, or can you only go in the Facebook world or the Google world?
That's a great question. And we're seeing a lot of companies investing heavily in this area right now. We're not seeing the products necessarily in all instances being rolled out just yet, but they're coming. Some of the bigger players that some of the audience member may have heard of would have been Facebook, which is now renamed as Meta. Microsoft is very involved in this space as well. And then there are video game companies like Epic, Roblox, and others who are actually getting more and more enhancements to their offerings right now. But the biggest piece that we're seeing that is interesting, it's a lot of these metaverses are what we call private or unconnected. What they're doing is they're creating these spaces, but they can't necessarily interact with one another. So a lot of the investment being made by the companies like Facebook and Microsoft are basically staking digital asset grounds, that space that Vas was mentioning earlier. They're trying to connect multiple of those down the road so they can have a comprehensive offering to individuals who want to try the metaverse. So you may be a gamer in one instance and you may be gaming with a particular company, but you may also want to do crypto transactions. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a bit later. They're going to start acquiring those type of assets and spaces with the hope that they can connect them. But at present, most of these environments are actually disconnected.
So that's an interesting point, Vas. You know, a lot of people talk about metaverse as kind of a game, but it actually can represent a lot more. You know, one of the things Zuckerberg has talked about Meta being used for is meetings taking place in the virtual world. There can be virtual stores in different metaverse worlds where you buy things using cryptocurrencies, digital currencies. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I think one aspect that's interesting and uncertain about the metaverse in that regard is the ability of people to create their own communities within them, right? So you've touched on the interoperability piece. Is this a competition issue? You know, is the barrier to entry for a new entrant or ostensibly maybe a more privacy-minded or more ethical company to be building a universe that has different ideals or different goals? And within the metaverse, can we make a private space for lawyers in the way that we can make a private group on Facebook and kind of have more controls over our audience and who we're interacting with? So in terms of what you can do, hosting meetings, obviously a natural precursor. I think in the pandemic, it's something we're familiar with. And maybe for a lot of people, that's going to be the right gateway to the metaverse because they're unfamiliar with the metaverses of video games, right? Or those experiences. So yeah, in terms of what you can do, I also think about it as what would people want to do beyond perhaps interactive shopping if you can't get to a mall, right? You can experience the grocery store instead of clicking your groceries online. I'm not sure consumers are demanding that quite yet.
If you, for example, just hypothetically, if you wanted to buy something online, could you only own that thing online? Or could you, if you went to a virtual grocery store, could you say, I want to order these things and then have them connected to your actual grocery store in the real world and have that delivered?
Imran, if you want to jump in, go ahead. My understanding is that you can own virtual goods and own virtual real estate, or that's part of the vision, but you can absolutely also have a shopping experience that then translates to our more familiar brick and mortar world, and those groceries that you selected get delivered to you.
Imran, you want to add to that?
That's exactly right. So let me give you an example. Atari has acquired space in the metaverse. They're building a campus there. Arguably, they're going to offer up goods and products that you can buy in that metaverse, maybe virtually or otherwise, with cryptocurrencies. And what they want to do, these companies that are investing heavily in these communities, as Vas mentioned, that they're trying to build, is to have a connection to the real world. So if you own X dollars worth of assets in the metaverse, can you then transact in the real world to translate that? That's the key here. And I think where a lot of the public policy issues and you feel free to jump in here, are going to come up is those who have the maximum market share in that space, how are they going to actually translate it into quote unquote the real world, the non-metaverse world, where they can actually say, you know what, if you want to do business in the metaverse, you have to deal with company A, B, or C.
Yeah, it raises some really interesting competition, or what would Americans call antitrust issues. It's really interesting stuff. I want to talk about some of the risks associated with these new technologies when we come back from the break. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the metaverse and legal policy and regulatory implications. Now, Vas, how would these kind of notions of community standards operate in the metaverse? The way they operate, in other on other platforms. For example, a lot of content on other platforms is monitored, but it also stays there as a permanent text. So you can see that someone did something or posted something that violates the community standards for being racist, violent, or whatnot. But in the metaverse, things are happening in real time. So how would the companies involved in these virtual worlds be able to deal with that?
How would they be able to deal with it? I mean, one, we could take away some of what we've been learning in content moderation, that automated management of these activities isn't quite enough. One hopes that we won't see gig-based work of people constantly kind of surveilling or monitoring the metaverse to prevent against these things. But you're hitting on a huge question, which is, are platforms like Meta, formerly Facebook, going to learn from some of the design or implementation failures of the past, where what we called, what was a proxy for policy and governance and rules was mushy and unevenly enforced. They have an incentive both to attract people to this space and also brands, and have them spend a lot of time there. So I think it has to be a safe place overall, and also something where the standard is very clear, but again, there's that consistency. And lastly, I'll just say, I think it's also such a huge question mark what people will want to do in this persistent 3D space. At least it's a huge question mark for me.
Imran, I want to touch on something different about some of the privacy implications of the metaverse. We've seen a lot of people raise these with traditional social platforms. But with the metaverse, some of these technologies could monitor, your eye movements and maybe even your breathing rate, your pulse. How can we deal with what information about not just what we're doing, but how our bodies are reacting in the metaverse, how that information is used, potentially stored, and potentially even sold to third parties? For example, pharmaceutical companies might be interested in knowing my blood pressure or my pulse, things like that.
Mm-hmm. So the points you raise, especially in the area of privacy, are exactly that. You have a company or a group of companies that are going to have this metaverse that's created. They're creating a whole new, different world. And that world is being monitored and maintained 24/7. There's no 9 to 5 there. So each time you are connected or in that metaverse, every piece of information from the real world, which is the sensor information that you were talking about, for example, or in the metaverse itself, if you're walking down a street or going into a meeting room or buying something in this metaverse, mall that they may create, for example, that is all going to be logged and recorded and kept. So that's a big concern. The physical information that is being collected in the real world, the metaverse activity that you're engaged in, and then thirdly, the point that you just made, what are they going to do with that data? If you have different folks coming into that marketplace, that metaverse space where they want to maybe not create it and maintain it, but play a small role, are the metaverse owners going to be able to share that without the consent of the individual? So that's those are 3 levels of significant concern that come up in privacy considerations. And the challenge that's going to come up in this is, how do you actually set up your privacy settings? it is not as obvious as when you have a 2D world that we're acting in right now. And nobody has really come up with a great solution on that. Facebook Meta has come up with some settings that you can establish, but again, it's early days. It's unidimensional in terms of the use.
Yeah, Vas, you want to jump in there?
Yes, thank you. I think we came up with an interesting solution in the Google Fitbit merger, right? Where there was this proposed remedy of a data silo. Because Christine, what you hit on was the ability to measure physiological responses to the metaverse, to ads, to your arousal, your heartbeat, your pulse, the dilation of your pupils when you see those special new Nike shoes in the metaverse.
Yeah.
Becoming a platform that can sell access to that kind of information and detect arousal is really the next generation of monetizing people, or that kind of targeted advertising. Because right now, our only proxy is whether or not somebody clicks on something. It's a very rich data set. And don't forget, your likeness is there. That's something else that advertisers don't have a sense of. What do people look like other than demographics?
Amazing points you guys have raised. These are really serious concerns. When we come back from this break, we're going to discuss it more. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the metaverse and the legal and policy implications. Now, Vas, I want to ask you, we know all of these platforms, traditional platforms, make money through advertising. So what does advertising look like in the metaverse? Is it sort of billboards on virtual walls? Is it product placement? Would it be like when YouTube stops my video unless I'm a premium, to show me an ad unless I'm a premium subscriber? Or is it all of this?
I think it's all of the above and more, actually. You could have sponsored spaces. Pokemon Go is an interesting precursor to metaverse ad placements now, right? The ability to draw people to a particular location and sell that access to that real estate. And again, you get that interactivity with objects that we were touching on earlier. So in all, a very video game-like experience. And one of the other holy grails is the ability to try on clothes. So though we have smart mirrors, et cetera, it's very hard for AI to make predictions about the drape of clothing. So it could revolutionize how we shop for things we wear.
Really interesting points. Now, one of the other things I want to turn to is cybersecurity, data security. Imran, what are the risks of accounts getting hacked or someone even impersonating you without hacking your account? We know that there have been problems on other platforms of people impersonating famous people with the ability to make your avatar look like someone else entirely. What are the risks there, including technology like deepfakes?
So the next generation of metaverse privacy issue we're thinking about is biometric data. So the sensor data you talked about, but be able to log into the metaverse through your eye pupil dilation and so on, or your fingerprint. Those are very unique to each human being. There's a set of zeros and ones. Once they get compromised, if a hacker can break into that company that's maintaining the metaverse and steal my personal biometric data, arguably they can go ahead and do a lot of things to me afterwards, especially where technology is going right now. So the risk is quite significant. It's not just within that metaverse universe, but everything that can be done by stealing or taking that biometric data, which cannot be replaced, cannot be secured after the fact.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about your eye, and I know that there are governments that, for example, there are airports that use your biometric data at customs. How do people keep that secure if this is a concern that we should have?
So one of the things that has been proposed to make it more secure is, instead of having that 0 and 1, the binaries stored in a system, to basically have sensors that will validate the person by having a trust environment. So systems will connect together and say, yeah, this is indeed Imran's pupil because we've checked this other piece, sort of a handshake, if you like. So that's where we're headed, I think. It's much more secure than simply having a copy of my eye.
So sort of two-step biometric verification. One last question for Vas. I want to know about malicious content in the metaverse. How would laws of defamation maybe work in the metaverse? How might they be different? And what about concerns over things like state-sponsored propaganda, which was something we saw as a serious issue in multiple elections in the Western world over the past years. How could that be a concern in the metaverse?
Well, I think it's an obvious concern out the gate, and my sense is that it's a little bit ambiguous in terms of what the interventions from the platforms that own and are operating the metaverses are going to have the courage, but also the ability to enforce. I think the expectation for most people is that this virtual pseudo replica of our world will have the same laws and rules apply. We're starting to see these issues come up again in gaming in interesting and important ways, but it's something that should be answered before we're all logging on.
Well, I know certainly I've done work on defamation on this show before, and we know that when it has an international element and an internet element, it can be especially difficult, and I think to deal with. And I think that that's probably going to be the case for the metaverse as well. I want to thank you both so much for joining me today. I have learned so much from this show and through researching the show, and I really appreciate you both coming on to share your unique expertise.
Thank you so much
for having me.
We've heard today about what the metaverse is and some unique legal, regulatory, and policy challenges it creates. I'll be honest, I had never heard of the metaverse until a few weeks ago, and in hosting this show, I really learned a lot. It seems like a new and exciting frontier, and like all new frontiers, it comes with its own risks and opportunities. But what do you think? Are you ready to dive into some new virtual worlds? Or will you wait until the new metaverse is better established and forgo the opportunities of early adoption? You be the judge. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.